On the 24th of October 1944, in the cold, wet woods of the Vosges Mountains in eastern France, a 23-year-old American sergeant named Charles Coolidge walked forward through the trees to scout out positions for his machine guns, and walked straight into an entire company of German infantry. He was almost alone. He had a carbine and a handful of men somewhere behind him, and in front of him were something like 100 enemy soldiers. Most men in that instant would have frozen or run or died. Charles Coolidge did something else. He looked at the German company that badly outnumbered him, and he decided to try to make them surrender to him. What happened over the next 4 days on that hill is one of the most remarkable small unit stands of the entire war in Europe. Understand how audacious this was. Coolidge had gone forward with just one other man, a sergeant who spoke German, to work out where to place his machine guns, and the two of them had blundered into an enemy force, perhaps 100 strong, in the trees. By every rule of war, Coolidge should have been captured or killed on the spot. Instead, he walked toward the Germans with an air of complete confidence and authority, as if he were the one holding all the cards, and called on them to lay down their arms and surrender. For a few seconds, in the confusion of the woods, it very nearly worked. The sheer nerve of it made the Germans hesitate, and then they got a good look at how few Americans were actually there, and they opened fire. Coolidge did not run. As the Germans opened up, he raised his carbine and coolly shot 2 of them down, and then he took charge, because there was no one else to do it. There was no officer anywhere in that little group of Americans. Charles Coolidge, a technical sergeant, was the senior man present, and in that moment he assumed command of the roughly 30 soldiers scattered around him on that hillside. And here is the part that made everything harder. Most of those 30 men were brand-new replacements who had only just arrived at the front. This was their first time in combat, their first time under fire, on a wooded hill in a foreign country, suddenly facing an entire German company. They were terrified. And their lives were now in the hands of one 23-year-old sergeant. So Charles Coolidge did the thing that would define him. As the German attack came in and the fire swept the position, he stood up and he walked. He walked along his line, out in the open, under close-range enemy fire, from man to terrified man, steadying them, encouraging them, showing them where to shoot, refusing to let them panic and break. A sergeant strolling calmly through a firefight is either a fool or a leader, and Coolidge was no fool. He understood that these green men would take their courage from him, that if he was calm they could be calm, and that the moment he flinched, they would all die. The attack broke against them and was thrown back. And that was only the first attack, on the first of 4 days. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. The hill Coolidge and his men were holding was Hill 623, near a village called Belmont-sur-Boutant, and it mattered. Their job was to cover the exposed right flank of their battalion, which meant that if the Germans broke through this little band of men, they could roll up the entire flank and put a much larger American force in serious danger. Coolidge understood the stakes, and he made his 30 men understand that they were not just fighting for themselves. They were the cork in the bottle. Over the 25th and 26th of October, the Germans came at that hill again and again, probing, attacking, trying to find a weak point in the thin American line, and again, the green replacements, steadied by the calm sergeant walking among them, threw the attacks back. It is worth pausing on what Coolidge was actually doing through those days, because it is the real substance of the Medal of Honor he would receive. He was not performing one dramatic act, he was performing 100 small ones, over and over, for days. Every time an attack came, he moved to where the fire was heaviest. He redistributed ammunition. He plugged gaps in the line where men had fallen. He talked constantly to the frightened replacements, using his own visible steadiness as a kind of armor for all of them. He barely slept. He was, for 4 days, the entire reason that thin line of inexperienced men did not simply come apart under the strain, and everyone on that hill knew it. The position held because Charles Coolidge would not let it fall. And think about it from the German side. They had run into what they must have first taken for a trivial obstacle. A handful of Americans, no officers, many of them obviously raw, sitting on a hill they needed to take. It should have taken an hour. Instead, for day after day, an enemy company, a force several times larger, hammered at that hill and could not break it, thrown back every single time by a defense that never seemed to crack. Whatever the Germans expected when they first saw how few and how green those Americans were, it was not this. A line that bent and held, hour after hour, day after day, anchored by one calm man they could not kill. So on the fourth day, they brought up something the infantry could not stop. They brought up tanks. On the morning of the 27th of October, the German infantry came on again. But this time behind two tanks, and that changed everything because tanks are very nearly the worst thing in the world for infantry on a hill to face. The Americans' rifles and machine guns, so effective against attacking foot soldiers, were useless against armor. The tanks could simply grind forward, shrugging off small arms fire, and blast the American positions apart one by one, or crush them under their tracks, and there was very little a group of riflemen could do about it. The whole four-day stand was about to be decided. Charles Coolidge looked at two German tanks rolling toward his thin, exhausted line, and he understood that if someone did not stop them, his men were finished, so he went to find a bazooka. Coolidge got a bazooka, the shoulder-fired rocket launcher, the one weapon a foot soldier had that could actually kill a tank, and then he did something that takes a moment to fully register. He did not fire it from cover at a safe distance. He crawled forward, out ahead of his own line toward the tanks, closing the range so he could not miss, until he was within about 25 yards of the lead tank. Close enough to see the details of it, close enough that the tank and the infantry around it could certainly see him. He lined up the shot that would save his men, on the tank that could destroy them all. He aimed, he fired, and the bazooka misfired. Nothing happened. The one weapon that could stop the tank simply failed in his hands, 25 yards from the enemy, in the open. Most men at that point die, or, understandably, break. Charles Coolidge did neither. He threw the useless bazooka aside, and instead of retreating, he grabbed every hand grenade he could carry, and he crawled forward closer into the teeth of the German attack. If he could not stop the tanks, he could still break up the infantry coming in behind them. And so he crawled through the fire and hurled grenades into the advancing enemy foot soldiers, one after another, throwing their assault into confusion, inflicting heavy casualties, and buying his men precious minutes. One sergeant, out ahead of his line, alone, meeting two tanks and a company of infantry with a bag of hand grenades and refusing to let them past. It could not last, and Coolidge knew it, but it lasted long enough. Long enough to save them. It finally became clear that the position could not be held. Two tanks and a full company against a shrinking handful of exhausted men has only one ending. And so Coolidge made the last hard decision of the four-day fight, to give up the hill, on purpose, in good order, to save the men who were left. This is much harder than it sounds. A withdrawal under fire, with the enemy pressing, is exactly the moment when a tired unit dissolves into a panicked rout and gets slaughtered from behind. Coolidge did not let that happen. He organized the pullback, held the men together, and personally stayed at the most dangerous spot, covering the withdrawal, making sure his green replacements got out alive before he did. He had held the flank for 4 days, and when he finally let the hill go, he brought his men out. For those 4 days on Hill 623, the bluff, the calm walk along the line under fire, the endless repelled attacks, the grenade crawl against the tanks, and the withdrawal that saved his men, Technical Sergeant Charles Coolidge received the Medal of Honor, but the citation, for all its detail, cannot tell you who this man was, or how he came to be standing on a hill in the Vosges in the first place, or why a printer's son from a small town in Tennessee turned out to be one of the coolest heads under fire in the entire United States Army. For that, we need to step back from the hill and look at the whole road that led him there. And it is a longer road than you might think. Before we trace that road, sit for a moment with what Coolidge actually did, because the heart of it is not the grenades or the tanks, it is the 30 frightened young men he refused to abandon. If this is the kind of history you want kept alive, the leaders who carried other people through the worst days of their lives, subscribe, because that is exactly what this channel exists to do. Years later, when people asked Charles Coolidge how he had done it, how he had walked through 4 days of fire and kept his nerve when everything said he should break, he did not talk about courage or medals or tanks. He gave a much simpler answer. "I didn't care about me," he said. "I cared about my men." That single sentence is the whole key to Charles Coolidge. Everything he did on that hill flows out of it. He walked the line under fire because his men needed to see him calm. He crawled out ahead with grenades because his men were behind him and someone had to stop what was coming. He organized the withdrawal and stayed to cover it himself because getting his men out alive mattered more to him than his own safety did. It was not that he had no fear. Any sane man facing 2 tanks with a bag of grenades is afraid. It was that he had decided completely that his fear was less important than their lives. That is a rare thing, and it is the thing the Medal of Honor is really meant to recognize. Not just bravery, but a total, self-forgetting devotion to the people you are responsible for. And the striking thing is how ordinary his origins were. Charles Coolidge was not a professional soldier, not a warrior by training or temperament. He was a young man from a small town in Tennessee, from a family in the printing business, who had been drafted into the army like millions of others when the war came, and who would go straight back to that quiet printing business the moment the war let him. There was nothing in his background that marked him out as a man who would one day master an entire battlefield with his own calm. And yet, by October 1944, he was already a combat veteran of some of the hardest fighting of the war, a man his green replacements were lucky beyond measure to have leading them, because the road that brought Charles Coolidge to that hill in the Vosges had already taken him through 2 years and 2 countries of war. So let us follow that road. To understand how a printer's son from Tennessee became the calmest man on Hill 623, we need to pull the lens all the way back to who Charles Coolidge was before the war, to the long and brutal campaign trail his division had already fought before it ever reached France, and to the strange, deadly mountains where this stand took place, a place that chewed up American units for weeks in the autumn of 1944. Only when you see the whole road does the 4-day stand come fully into focus. This is the context that Hill 623 sits inside. Charles Henry Coolidge was born in 1921 in Signal Mountain, Tennessee, a small community near Chattanooga, into a family that ran a printing and engraving business. He was, by every account, a calm, level, unremarkable young man, the kind who would have lived a quiet, decent, entirely peaceful life if the world had let him. But the world did not. Coolidge was drafted into the Army in 1942 and assigned as an infantryman to the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, a former National Guard outfit that was about to see some of the most sustained hard fighting of any American division in the war. From the quiet of a Tennessee print shop, Charles Coolidge was about to be sent on a 2-year journey through the bloodiest battlefields of the Mediterranean and Europe. And what a journey it was. The 36th Division went first to North Africa, and then, in September 1943, it made the invasion of Italy at Salerno, and from there it fought its way up the Italian peninsula through some of the worst battles of the war. Salerno, the Anzio beachhead, the terrible mountain fighting around Monte Cassino, and finally into Rome. Coolidge was in all of it, and in Italy he earned a Silver Star for directing his machine guns so effectively against an enemy attack that he shattered it. By the time the division was pulled out of Italy and sent to France in the late summer of 1944 to help drive toward Germany, Charles Coolidge was no longer a raw draftee. He was a hardened, deeply experienced combat sergeant, which is exactly why, when he walked into that German company in the Vosges, he did not panic. The place the 36th Division reached in October 1944 was the Vosges Mountains, a range of steep, densely forested hills in eastern France, close to the German border, and it was a nightmare to fight in. The terrain was all cold, wet, tangled woods and sharp ridges, perfect for defense, where a few determined men could hold up an army, and where cold and rain and disease wore the attackers down as surely as bullets did. The autumn of 1944 in the Vosges was a grinding, miserable, costly campaign that has been largely forgotten next to the more famous battles of that year. It was here, holding one wooded hill among hundreds, Hill 623, covering his battalion's flank, that Charles Coolidge, the calm printer's son from Tennessee, made the stand that would define his life. So hold the whole road in your mind now. A quiet young man from a Tennessee print shop, a division that fought from the deserts of North Africa through the mountains of Italy and into the forests of France. And a Vosges campaign so brutal and so forgotten that even the men who fought it struggled to make anyone understand it afterward. Knowing all of that, the 4 days on Hill 623 stop looking like a lucky accident and start looking like exactly what they were. The moment when everything Charles Coolidge had learned in 2 years of hard war came together in one man on one hill to save 30 frightened boys who would otherwise have died. And what he did with the rest of his long life is its own quiet answer to the question of who he really was. On the 18th of June, 1945, in occupied Germany, Charles Coolidge received the Medal of Honor for what he had done on Hill 623. And then he did the most Coolidge thing imaginable. He went home to Signal Mountain, Tennessee, and went back to work at the family printing business and got on with an ordinary, quiet, decent life. He ran the print shop. He raised a family. He became a pillar of his small community, a modest, gentle, deeply humble man, whom you might have known for years as the fellow who ran the printing company, without ever suspecting that he had once held a hill in the Vosges against tanks with a bag of grenades. He almost never sought attention for what he had done, and he wore the nation's highest military honor with a quietness that says as much about him as the medal itself does. And Charles Coolidge lived a very long time. He carried his war quietly for decade after decade, watching the world change around him, one of a slowly vanishing band of men who had done extraordinary things in their youth and then come home to build ordinary lives. He died in April of 2021 at the age of 99, one of the very last surviving Medal of Honor recipients of the Second World War, nearly the end of a whole generation. For 76 years after that hill, the calm printer from Signal Mountain lived among neighbors who mostly knew him simply as a good man and a good citizen. The tanks and the grenades and the 4 days of fire had happened to a 23-year-old who then spent 3/4 of a century simply being decent. That, too, is a kind of heroism. Technical Sergeant Charles Henry Coolidge of Signal Mountain, Tennessee, of the 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Division, the printer's son who walked into a German company and told them to surrender, who took command of 30 terrified replacements with no officer to help him, who walked his line under fire for 4 days, who crawled to within 25 yards of a tank, and when his weapon failed, fought on with grenades, and who then brought his men out alive, was one of the finest combat leaders the United States Army ever produced. He lived to 99, and he never stopped believing the simplest thing, that it was never about him, it was about his men. Somewhere, the descendants of 30 green replacements who came home from the Vosges are alive today because one sergeant cared more about them than about himself. When you are outnumbered and afraid and there is no one coming to help you, you can do one of two things. You can think about saving yourself, or you can think about saving the people beside you. Charles Coolidge, at 23, with a German company in front of him and 30 frightened boys behind him, made that choice instantly and never once wavered from it across 4 days of fire. "I didn't care about me," he said. "I cared about my men." That is the whole of leadership, in 7 words, spoken by a man who proved every one of them on a hill in the Vosges, and it is why 30 men lived who would otherwise have died. Charles Coolidge came home and lived quietly for 76 years, and most of the country never learned his name, which is exactly why places like this comment section matter. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, anyone in your family fought in the Vosges, or served with the 36th Division, or fought their way up through Italy and into France, or led frightened men through the worst day of their lives, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did or said, or one thing you remember. The quiet ones who saved everyone around them and then never spoke of it deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.